know when to break rules when it comes to screenwriting? There are a lot of rules: formatting, voice, style, page count, all of these rules that say this is the industry standard. Okay, so how do I know how to use my unique voice or point of view to potentially break any of those rules? Well, this commenter had this very question, which is a very valid question about breaking the rules. And it says, check out Breaking Bad script or the script for A Quiet Place. You'll be shocked at all the instances where breaking the formatting rules and times where they described what a character's thinking, people like you, or why so many studios passed on Breaking Bad. So what this commenter is referring to is this video up here. That's me. Hello. And I'm explaining format, the basic format, formatting 101. The very beginning, if you're starting writing, here's how you format a screenplay. And in that, I did give advice that you don't use action lines to describe how a character feels, because what ends up on screen is only based on dialogue and action. And outside of that, it won't end up on screen. No matter how beautifully you wrote it in the action lines, the audience will never see it. Now, to this commenter's point, there are instances where writers break the rules, and it's very well done. So the one that he mentioned was specifically about talking about how characters feel or what they're thinking in the action lines. He didn't mention any other ones, but I'm gonna talk about that one, and then we can talk about a few other ways that writers break these rules. When writers are describing how a character feels or what they're thinking in the action lines, a lot of times when you're writing a screenplay, it's almost impossible to completely leave out what a character is thinking or feeling. For example, Sarah is walking down the sidewalk. She trips. She looks up embarrassed to see if anyone has seen her. Okay, that's an action, right? She looks up and she looks around. Me saying she looks up embarrassed is describing how she feels. It's a more subtle, small way to do it, but it is describing how she feels and what she's experiencing. And when I see that on screen, there's no way for me to know what the writer said, right? Because it's not dialogue and it's not a direct action. The tripping is an action. Her looking up is an action. Her being embarrassed is not a direct action. So with that, when it comes to writing, it is natural to include some percentage of what a character is thinking or feeling. Here's why I tell you not to do that. Because I want to strain as much of that out of your writing practice as possible. Here's why. Because the art form of writing for the screen is a specific art form. Let's go back a minute. A screenplay is a map. It's an art form, but it's a map. It's a map for production. That's the tool it is. That's why it tells you whether it's interior, exterior, whether it's day or night. That's why when you break down a script, you break down how many characters, how many scenes, and eventually how many days based on that map. Your script communicates to the crew and everyone involved, including all departments, what needs to be done to take this thing on paper to something on the screen. Because your screenplay is a map primarily, that's its primary job, then you as a writer, when you're effective, you're most effective when you're communicating via this map that is your screenplay. Because it's also an art form. That isn't to say that artists don't take certain licenses when writing this map to show their style, their technique, their very particular voice. Particularly as you move forward in your career, there is a lot more lenience toward that voice because people are familiar with their voice. And a lot of writers who are very famous seem like they pop up on the screen or pop up out of nowhere, when underneath that tip of the iceberg of what you see is such a foundation of what I'm describing to you, because the screenplay, even if it includes some of that finesse, the foundation of that is already there. Otherwise, when you get to the screen, it wouldn't communicate the emotions it needs to communicate because the map is not there. Does that make sense? I know I'm saying a lot of words. Let me make it simple. What I'm saying is, Some writers do choose, in particular, to add emotions or thoughts in the action lines. That only works when the dialogue and the action also tells the story without the finesse of what's happening in the action lines. Meaning, if you were to rip out those thoughts and emotions from the action lines, the dialogue and the actions still have to tell the story, because as beautifully written as some of those things can be, they're still not going to end up on screen. So you still need that foundation that the primary modicum of communication of what's happening with these characters is still dialogue and action. It's always going to be dialogue and action. I don't care who wrote it or how beautifully it's written or how many rules somebody breaks. The reason why I tell my students, why I'm telling you not to do that, is because particularly when you're starting out, it can be a crutch. When you're new to the format of writing for the screen, it can be a crutch to write emotions and thoughts in the action lines, because you're automatically assuming that the audience is going to telepathically understand what the character is dealing with when you're not using action and dialogue primarily as a tool to communicate to the audience what it is you want to say. I hope that makes sense. So while this commenter is absolutely correct about some writers, very famous writers, break the rules in certain ways, the way I'm always going to teach you is how to use a tool most effectively, so that if you do, and I'm sure at some point in your career you will, decide to break the rules, quote unquote, as you continue to find your voice and deepen your voice, you will know how to do that without skipping the step of communicating with the primary tool of sight and sound. That's all film is, sight and sound. And unless you have fine-tuned how to communicate that on screen, then all the other stuff literally does not matter. And as you fine-tune your voice and get more into it, break whatever rule you want. But I'm never going to teach you that, because my job is to make sure you know how to be a writer and do what you will after that. Now, to his point, down here where he says, I'd refer you to Screenwriting Truth if you want to learn more about screenwriting myths. I also follow this guy. I think he's brilliant. I think he is very transparent and tells a lot of truth about screenwriting, and not just screenwriting, but building a career in screenwriting. So yeah, go follow this guy. I follow him, and I find a lot of value in what he has to say. Now, in terms of the culture of my page, the culture of my page is meant to build community, be helpful, and to share any expertise that I may have or that we may have. The whole point is to build community and move our careers forward. If I know it, you know it, that's the point. I'm going to share everything I know. And as someone who makes a lot of decisions in terms of moving people's scripts forward, particularly in the format that I work in, I'm going to share what I know. I'm going to share what I understand. And I'm going to share what I see moving forward, being bought, being sold, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the whole point. I am not the end all be all for anyone. And I implore you, I say this all the time, research. I implore you to do an incredible amount of research. I implore you to experiment. I implore you to read as much as possible, to write as much as possible. This commenter, added some writers. I think they're here, down here. The writers that he mentioned, that I think several of them are brilliant writers. You should be reading as much as possible, writing as much as possible, sharing as much as possible, being generous as much as possible. There is so much room for even emerging writers to share what they know, and my hope is that this continues to be a safe and uplifting space.